So thank you all for coming today and joining us this afternoon for our Bridging for Sustainability event. Today's talks will be focused on Sustainable Development Goals 14 and 15, which are life below water and life on land. And I'll get into a little bit more on what those are in a minute here, but thanks again for coming. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So our team here is with our research and curriculum committee is Nirja Havaliji, Tahira Abbas, Pranoti Deshmukh, Justin Berrio, Jay Pasari, Erica Risberg, and myself. So thanks everybody for all the work that you've done in making these happen, even in the midst of quarantine. So I really appreciate everybody's hard work, and I'm sure everybody else here does too. So thank you for that. So what we're trying to do here is just our efforts are in how do we make our communities more sustainable? You know, I know that I frequently find that in the face of so many hurdles, it can be a little bit difficult to get up in the morning, let alone try and work towards just any sort of progress towards a more sustainable future. Have to remind myself not to let the seeming insurmountability of these global hurdles prevent me from working to understand how they manifest here in Portland and working to address those manifestations. But you know, working together and elevating each other's voices, I think, is a good way to start, and a good way to continue to work towards these positive outcomes that we all seek, addressing, you know, legacies of colonialism and the act of imperialism and resource extraction going on by all of the capitalist governments of the world, and the willful ignorance in the face of such existential threats as climate change and COVID-19 that the governing elites seem like they are adamant to perpetuate. So even with that, despite that ceaseless onslaught of bad news, there is a pretty steady flow of good news as well. You know, the drops in pollution and consumption associated with COVID-19 indicate that human society is adaptable when it needs to be, and that growth-based narratives of prosperity are just myths perpetuated to increase the wealth of shareholders without regard for much else. Important work is being done and shared every day, and keeping up with all these developments in the world of sustainability is a challenge. So, you know, what we are trying to do with this little event series and series of meetings is just raise awareness about the work being done in our own community to address some of these issues. So our goal is to bring people together and talk about sustainability. Who do we want to bring together? We want to bring people interested in making our society more sustainable, and people who actively do the work that it takes to make that happen. In our brainstorming efforts, we identified and created this little diagram to sort of frame our efforts for bringing people together. And we thought that there's this triangle of research, practice, and policy, which of course is a Venn diagram that overlaps significantly in many places. But there are frequently times when people were working on identical goals without knowledge of one another's work, even in the same communities. And so hopefully by facilitating communication between groups working on similar issues, we can raise awareness about the work that's being done and who's doing it. So the way that we go about this is to facilitate these dialogues between these groups working on similar issues and members of the public, concerned citizens that want to learn about that work and support it. So the Sustainable Development Goals are developed by the UN and represent a blueprint to achieve a more sustainable future. Today, we're focusing on SDGs 14 and 15, which are life below water and life on land. And our speakers work on issues associated with the environment and environmental justice. And of course, there's plenty of overlap frequently between many of these other goals as well. So these are kind of just the framing of our goals that of the various events that we have. So our speakers today will be Cassie Cohen and Ibrahim Mubarak with Portland Harbor Community Coalition. PHCC is a group of community groups that works on elevating the most impacted groups in the $1 billion federal cleanup of the 11-mile wide Willamette River Superfund site at Portland Harbor. Kevin Thomas, PhD candidate in urban studies and planning at PSU, and has been working to better link PSU's diversity and cultural services with sustainability programs and efforts on campus and in the community. And lastly, Ryan Rittenhouse with Friends of the Columbia Gorge, who and they work to protect the gorge from pollution and polluters and preserve the natural beauty of the gorge while informing and preserving the public about its history. So with that, I will hand this off to Cassie and Ibrahim, and I hope everybody enjoys this, and thanks again for coming.
Yeah, again, thank you, Owen and Tahira and everyone on the committee for inviting us to be a part of this. I'm excited to hear from the other two presenters as well. And yeah, maybe we can, and I look forward to a little Q&A hopefully towards the end. So you heard a little bit about our coalition. I will, let's see, let you know that we have about 40 organizations that are part of our coalition. It's a mix of groups that are, neighborhood organizations, environmental groups, grassroots organizations, environmental justice organizations, people of color-led groups, houseless advocacy, minority contractors. It's kind of a mix. It's a big mix of groups, and we partner a lot with higher education and partner with government agencies and others. And our leadership is we have a steering committee that is has representatives from the different disproportionately impacted communities that Owen shared with you in the opening. And so we'll talk a little bit about kind of how we define impacted communities in the case of the Willamette River and the history of the river, kind of the history, and then also the current day's exposure for people and animals and different kind of groups of people. So where are we? That's our first question that we're starting out with. We thought we'd talk a little bit about kind of the very current political situation that the whole country's in, with the Environmental Protection Agency having been experienced even greater deregulation than already existed. So even kind of right as the coronavirus, started becoming a major issue, my guess is everyone who's watching the news and the environment in the news is aware that the Trump administration passed some major deregulation. So that made us concerned about our river here, but also concerned about every other kind of industry that causes a risk to the environment, to people, to wildlife. So we checked in with the regional EPA here to find out how does that impact the cleanup of the Superfund site. And what they said was, really it's gonna take a lot of effort for a polluter to make the case that they are experiencing hardship or inability to move forward with the work. For example, if a testing lab, if the laboratory is closed and they can't collect samples and process those sediment samples in the lab, they can, they have to provide evidence and make a case and write it up, and has to get approved by EPA to slow things down. So there might be some delay, but we've been reassured by EPA that the cleanup process is still moving forward. But where we are also is with the ongoing exposure of toxins that cause cancer and other harmful effects to people and animals. So we have a lot of people who fish in the who consume resident fish just off the banks of the river, and many immigrants and refugees who are subsistence fishers from their home countries come here and depend on the carp or other fish. And we talk about the Black community, many of whom worked in the Kaiser shipyards building warships or deconstructing warships, were exposed on the job back in the day to harmful toxins without knowing that they were being exposed. And then many of families back in the day used to fish on a regular basis down there, catfish or other fish, bass, crappie, all of those fish consume the toxins at the bottom of the river and get PCBs in their systems. And then when we consume those fish, it gets in our systems and it stays, and it's not good news. And then, of course, Native Americans have treaty rights to fishing in the Willamette. There's 6 treaty trustee tribes, and their rights are being challenged on an ongoing basis because of the lack of safe fish to consume, and other species, lamprey that are compromised, clams and mussels and such. And then Ibrahim, do you want to talk a bit about the houseless, quickly about the houseless community?
I'm Ibrahim Mubarak. I work for Portland Harbor Community Coalition, and I'm the outreach coordinator. I'm also a houseless advocate, and that's how I got involved with Portland Harbor Community Coalition, because I don't know if you all know where sweeps are, but that's when they move houseless people from place to place, and now they don't have anywhere to go, so they've been going living in the open space and environmental space. And the people were saying that the houseless people are destroying the beautiful landscape and environment. And so Cassie and I got together. We did a video of Right to Survive, going out talking to houseless people, where anybody really that was along the Willamette Cove. And when we went there, we saw a lot of mutant fish and tadpoles, and these jelly things look like a bunch of jellyfish that had came up on the shore. And it wasn't no warning signs to let people know about the toxins that's in the water, and to let women know that they're not supposed to eat no fish. I think a pound of fish or half a pound, something like that, for a month or something out the water. And so the big question was, if they're sweeping houseless people out to the edge of land, where are they to go? What are they to eat? What are they to drink? Where do they use the restroom? Where do they throw their garbage? Where do they sleep? And so we we invite them to the meetings to try to educate them more about that toxic water. And we saw that when we went there, a lot of houseless people had blotches on their skin. They were losing their teeth, and the dogs was even losing their fur. Their pets were losing their fur. And so we saw some growing gardens out there so they can have good vegetables. But if that water is coming along the land, if that sediment is toxic. So what they're doing, they're eating toxic vegetables and stuff. So we try very much to inform them, but how can you tell people who's hungry not to eat that fish? Or swim in that water to be clean or drink it. And so hopefully this message will get the ones who've been polluting the water to clean it up so people can live there and participate recreational way.
Thank you. Thanks, Ibrahim. Yep, so that's, part of our work is to raise awareness as much as we can in the community so people can make their own informed decisions about what they can do and hopefully be part of the solution as well. But yeah, finally, there is some movement towards cleanup after a long delay. And it's, if you ask EPA, they'll blame it on the polluters. If you ask the polluters, they'll blame it on EPA. But, to the community, it's like a whole generation. So, we have elders that are part of our coalition who now have lost hope that anything's going to change in their lifetime, and they're looking towards their grandchildren's future. Go to the next slide. So where do we want to go? Obviously the big picture goal for, after years and years of dialogue with community members has been this vision of having a river that's safe for people to feel, even if it's, even if the agencies technically say it's safe to swim and recreate, a lot of people still feel like it's unsafe. Their perception is that it's unsafe. Safe for people to consume any kind of fish down there. And safe for wildlife too, for the birds of prey and other animals. People in our coalition and out in the community want greater access to the river in the Superfund site. Once it's cleaned up, they feel like it's highly industrialized, and it has been for a long time, and there's lack of equity around access in North Portland. And so we're pushing to expand access and to make it clean enough for in spots such as Willamette Cove, which is owned by Metro Regional Government. It's a 27-acre site in North Portland, right on the river. And then we want to see the cleanup done equitably, and what we mean by that is that that it's not business as usual by having big mega general contractors come in from outside of the state who work on every other Superfund site and have a crew that they bring with them that do not necessarily have access to living wage jobs or safety standards, that kind of thing. So
and then the job. Go ahead, Catherine.
What's that?
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Forgive me. I was ready to talk about job training and job.
Yeah, exactly. So jobs. Yeah. So we hope to have jobs training for, especially for impacted communities, and to have that lead into career pathways for impacted communities, and for minority contractors, women run contracting firms, and to have apprenticeship opportunities, and even have a chance for young folks through workforce development programs and pre-apprenticeship programs to be able to have a part in the habitat restoration that happens after the dredging and the capping of the toxic sediment and removal of toxic sediment. But all of that we feel like is an opportunity for equitable procurement and hiring and training, and that's what equity means for us.
We also hoping and pushing that the houseless people that live in that area, that they can get hired for job training, and that'll help get them off the street, because they'll be making a living wage and getting some new career.
Yeah, and to also think about houseless folks as potential stewards for the land, to be able to, monitor and make sure that it stays clean and get paid to do that kind of work as well. And we hope to see this done through what's called a community benefits agreement. It's a tool that is basically used for major infrastructure projects by communities who see that there's a potential to make sure that the benefits come back to the community and don't go out. And so we're working with a lot of partners, and we'd love to join anyone who else would like to join to draft up a community benefits agreement that we will then share with the city of Portland and the state of Portland and the port of Portland in hopes of having actually a legally binding agreement that's a good faith agreement that all community stakeholders and labor unions and government can agree to, and then that sets standards for how many women to hire and sustain on the job, how many Black Black apprenticeships, for example, and it just sort of spelling it out, disaggregating what our priorities are and standards in a written agreement. And then Superfund site is notorious for being behind closed doors, and so we hope to expand transparency and for the community to have access in sort of real time to information that is critical for them to know what's happening and to be able to weigh in on the process. And then how do we get there? Oh, I guess I covered one bullet already. I forgot I had it on here around community benefits agreements. So, but yeah, our coalition is just about building community power and sort of expanding the numbers of people and organizations that are tracking this, and to hold industry accountable, and to even hold our government agencies accountable, because oftentimes they forget about the interests of the people and are more concerned about their bottom line and liability and confidentiality. So we remind the agencies sort of over and over in a gentle way that we're taxpayers and we all live here and we all have rights to know and to participate in decision making. And Ibrahim, you want to touch on the other two bullets?
Yeah, again, as I said before, they need to stop the fleet for people trying to survive, and that's why houseless people can't get settled, because they always looking on where they're going to sleep, and when people sleep deprived, they can't think right. It can cause mental issues. So if we can have people be more stable and join and help us with this campaign, I think it would be wise to the city. I'm sorry, that's the Don being called. Wise for them to stop doing that because we did, what was that, 2014? We signed, we did a community benefit agreement, and that's when the city took notice of it, and they was gonna clean up 8% of the river. Am I right, Cassie?
Oh, no. Well, the record of decision was created in 2016 by EPA. And because there was such a massive amount of public comments, 5,300, I think the most on the West Coast of any Superfund process, which, you know, we were a big part of that, but many other groups pushed for public comments. Yeah, EPA upped the cleanup level in a pretty substantial way because of that. So we use that technique or that tactic, I guess, to sort of flood public comment processes. And then are also, trying to push the agencies in other ways. But yeah, currently, so, here's our contact information. If anyone's interested in learning more about, there's a couple of public comment processes open right now. One is for the EPA, the Portland Harbor Community Involvement Plan, and the other is for the 27 acres I mentioned earlier called Willamette Cove. It's for Oregon Department of Environmental Quality's sort of plan for the cleanup of that site, and that's open. And we're happy to share some community talking points that we pieced together based on feedback and advice that we got, and our knowledge and awareness about that site. So again, thank you so much for having us, and we're eager to engage in questions and Q&A, and then to hear from the other folks. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cassie and Ibrahim, for this incredible work you're doing. And thank you for joining us today to share that work with all of us. I've also visited these incredible story videos on your website, and honestly feel very humbled by the work you do. So I invite everyone to go have a look at these story videos on PHCC website. I'll try to put it in the chat room right now. So now we're gonna pass to Kevin.
Okay, I'm here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna try to share the screen. Okay.
Lisa, can you come forward?
So I just really have two slides, and I think I can get through what I need to say pretty quickly, just to respect the time, because I think we're finishing up at 5:30. Is that?
No, we extended it by half an hour, so you're good.
Okay. So the first slide, first thing I need to say is I do not identify as Native American, but I do work with the Native community very closely in a lot of projects. So I feel comfortable to talk about the theory of decolonizing sustainability. And what I mean by that is to make it less Western Eurocentric focused, make it less privilege focused. And an example of that is people encouraging folks to buy expensive cars like a Prius because it saves a lot of gas. A lot of people, especially in communities of color, can't afford cars like that. They can't afford to put solar panels on their houses. They can't afford a lot of things. And they see the university as being very, excuse me for the crows, they're hanging out in the backyard here. They see the university as being very Eurocentric, and developing theories like permaculture, and then trying to explain it to Native people. And Native people said, well, we were living in unison with the environment all along, so we don't need to be taught that. That's what we did. So I put up this, what's called a medicine wheel. I'm not going to go through the whole thing now, but it's just one of the philosophies that some Native people use to describe the world around them. In this example, it's 4 directions. Some communities believe in 6 directions. They would include up and down, and some communities believe in 7 directions. They would include in. But mostly, you'll see this type of medicine wheel. What I want to get to is just reimagining how we look at sustainability, how we look at our environment and our place in it. I'm going to try and switch to my next slide here. Okay. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I will say that on the left side, it says the settler colonial tools and analytics will never rebuild indigeneity, meaning that Western philosophy and practices will not get us back to where we were living with the land. I say we, prior to settlers, the people that lived here. And the Western philosophy of trying to reinvent the wheel and doing it in a way that they don't include the local people, the local indigenous people. So I think that it's a very basic philosophy that rather than invent the wheel, why don't you just go talk to the people who lived here for thousands of years and didn't screw the place up when you're looking for solutions on how to treat the land. The Western philosophy of taming nature, of owning a foreign valued system for to the people that lived here originally. When the Lewis and Clark expedition and subsequent settlers came out here, they saw the beautiful land and they just assumed that it was just here. It was just, that's the way it was here. They couldn't conceive of, because of stereotypes and racism, they couldn't conceive that the native people were actually managing the land, and that the land cannot survive actually very well without being managed, and that the natives had long-term traditional fire management practices, traditional growing practices, traditional harvesting practices, and a deeper respect for nature, because they felt and feel that they are part of nature and not above it. Whereas Western philosophies tend to teach us that we are humans and we're superior to everything else in nature and not part of nature, we're above it. I think that that's a dangerous philosophy to have. So I just want to cite a couple examples. Since we were talking about water and land, I wanted to talk, the example of water I wanted to use is Flint, Michigan. And for people that may not be familiar with that, just very briefly, it's just over 200 years ago that the settlers moved into the Flint, Michigan area. And pretty shortly after that, started using the river there as a dumping ground, the trash bin for the city, the growing city. To the point where in the 1950s, the water in the river was so polluted that people couldn't drink it anymore. And the city had to switch its source of drinking water to another city. They had to start paying for the water from another city. And that went on till about a little bit more than 5 years ago, where the state government decided they were going to save money by switching Flint's drinking water back to the river, the polluted river. Once they made that decision, there was one of two things happened. One, they didn't test the water to see how polluted it was and how dangerous it was. Or two, they did test the water, knew how dangerous it was, and switched it back anyway, because the people that were going to be drinking it were poor people. Consequently, they poisoned the water system, have permanently, giving people permanent brain damage, cost millions and millions of dollars, much more than they would have had to spend on water had they not switched it back. If we look at a native philosophy of the, say, seventh generation principle means that when you make a decision, you will consider how this decision will affect your people in 7 generations. So if the people that had moved to Flint, the settlers that had moved to Flint just over 200 years ago, had employed that philosophy, they would not have started dumping things into the river to pollute it. And if you think about just over 200 years ago, if you think about generation as being 30 years, that's 7 generations ago. So if they had made that decision when they arrived, they would not be in the situation they are in now. And that is a different philosophy about how you treat water, that it's just there for you to do whatever you want. Another example for the land part of this conversation, I want to talk about oak savannas. Now, an oak savanna is a naturally occurring forest that is populated by oak trees. It used to be all up and down the West Coast. We are currently down to below 5% of oak savannas. They've been destroyed. But the natives used the oak savannas as they're basically farms. They would collect the acorns from the trees, and they would plant their crops in between the trees, and the trees would provide shelter and encourage wildlife to come through there, and they could hunt the wildlife. And then every year they would have controlled burns where they would burn down the stalks of the plants they had harvested, and they would burn down. It would keep the pine trees in control. Once that controlled burning stopped, pine trees outgrew the oaks. The shade didn't allow the oaks to grow, and the land was no longer managed. The result of that is that, and we're going to see it again coming up pretty soon, is when we have fire season, the land out here is not being managed well at all. And so we have these horrific fires, and now we're starting to lose entire towns during the fires. And thousands and thousands of acres and millions of dollars are spent basically because the settlers didn't ask the native people how to take care of this land out here, and still don't. You'll see a little bit of cooperation going on now, but generally the native philosophies are ignored because, like I said, racism and prejudice. They don't believe that native people had science or had stewardship. They just believe that they just existed here and were hunter-gatherers. That's largely caused by racist movies and television programs and a lack of inclusion in the classroom in history. So one thing you can do as for the folks that are listening here is you can ask yourself, how familiar are you with indigenous methods and theories of land management? This is a rhetorical question. I'm not expecting an answer now, but ask yourself that. And then if the answer is, I don't really know anything, then the next question you would ask yourself is, why not? And the why not part is, it's intentional that the dominant culture curriculum ignores natives, and or when they do include natives, it's very stereotypical. So you, as a interested party, are going to have to do self-directed training. Train yourself, read articles, understand how things operated here or wherever you happen to be, because native practices changed with the environment. It's not a one size fits all type of answer there. It really depends on where you are and what kind of environment you're in. So wherever you are, read about how the land was managed. You have to take on that responsibility yourself. Don't expect native people to teach you. You can take classes. I know they at Portland State, they have classes on this kind of thing in the Native Studies department. But we have to change our outlook, our world view. And we have to change our value system when it comes to determining what's the best way to engage with nature and to view sustainability and to teach sustainability. And I think that's pretty much my message. Just to be respectful, and working with the Native community can be difficult because of the history of how Natives were treated. So developing relationships is not necessarily easy, but it's necessary. And a lot of government organizations now are starting to hire tribal liaisons. I know the city of Portland has a tribal liaison. Metro's hiring one to try and engage the Native community in when decision-making time happens. But that's pretty rare. That's pretty rare. In most places, government agencies do not. But yeah, I would say it's not going to be easy to develop those relationships, but it's necessary. All right, thanks. I'm just gonna.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for sharing that perspective, for sharing always with us your knowledge from Native American history perspective. Thanks again.
Thank you.
We're going to pass the mic now to Ryan.
Ready, thank you very much. I'll get the screen up here. So first of all, thank you all very much. It's really a pleasure and honor to be included among the panelists today. And I'm very grateful to also be going third, so I got to hear the other presentations first. It helps influence and inform my presentation. So really good to hear from both of you. Thank you, all three of you actually. Thank you very much. So my name is Ryan Rittenhouse. I'm the conservation organizer with Friends of the Columbia Gorge. And we are the only nonprofit that specifically is focused on preserving and protecting the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area. For those of you who aren't too familiar with it, the National Scenic Area does have federal designation as a protected area, and it extends from the Sandy River Delta, which you can see there on the map, all the way east out to the Deschutes River in eastern Oregon. And it's on both sides of the Columbia for that entire stretch. It stretches for over 80 miles. And so what I wanted, when I was thinking about what to talk to you about today, really focused on that below the water aspect of it, and figured that it would make a lot of sense to talk to you about what Friends has been doing in relation to wetlands restoration, habitat restoration, especially as it pertains to salmon. There's a lot of issues when it comes to water contamination and the need to rehabilitate water systems in the Pacific Northwest, obviously. But I think most people would agree at the top of the list is wildlife habitat, especially as it pertains to salmon. Salmon is a Native American first food, and it's also a vital food for just everybody living in the area in general. And it's also a vital component to the healthy ecosystem. And there's two big threats to salmon. There's a lot of threats to salmon, but the two primary threats, I think I wouldn't be remiss to say, are dams and loss of habitat. which are interconnected, right? Dams create loss of habitat as well. So if you want to know more about this, there have been 2 documentaries that have been released in the last few years. One is called Dam Nation, that covers the impact that dams have on the salmon. And there's another good one that was released even more recently called Artificial, and that focuses on the salmon habitat itself and specifically how fish farming enters into that. How hatcheries and fish farms impact wild salmon, which is in a negative way. So yeah, if you have any questions about any of that, I'd be happy to answer them. But those 2 good documentaries, if you haven't seen them yet, or if you don't know a ton about the issue, can really help educate you on that. So what is this I'm talking to you about today? Well, this specific project is the dashed red line you see there. That general area is the Steigerwald National Wildlife Refuge. If those of you on the call aren't familiar with it, if you were driving along Highway 14 on the Washington side, as soon as you enter into the National Scenic Area, and there'll be a big sign on the right-hand side of the road that says, "Welcome to the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area," you have there just entered into the Steigerwald National Wildlife Refuge as well. It's all the land right off to the right of your car. And it's open to the public and accessible. But right now it is not a wetlands. There was a dike built to prevent the Columbia River from flooding into that area, largely because some of the land to the eastern end of the refuge was private land that was used for cattle ranching. Friends of the Columbia Gorge has been working for years with that landowner to purchase that land and to get it prepared to be handed over to the National Wildlife Refuge so that it could be incorporated into the refuge. And then the idea is to breach the dike that has been separating the Columbia River from the refuge for all these decades and return the refuge to its original wetlands habitat. And that will create vital habitat for juvenile salmon in the area. So to give you more of an area, and if you want to keep context, you see Reed Island there. That'll be kind of a good way to keep your context as I flip through these next photos. But here's a historic photo, and there you can see Reed Island there again, and the dashed red line shows the project area of the National Wildlife Refuge. And this is a historic flood. As you can see in the bottom there, this happened in 1948. So that shows you what happens and how wetlands naturally acts as flood control and flood mitigation when these historic floods happen. But what they did was they built a dike all along this barrier here, and that prevents the Columbia River from flooding into that wetlands and using it as natural flood mitigation. It also prevents it from being used as habitat for salmon. And so this is showing you that there again, there's Reed Island, and that black bold line is what used to be private land, private ranch land. And this land over here is the refuge. So Friends of the Columbia Gorge purchased this land, and now we actually just finished converting it over into ownership for the Wildlife Refuge last week. And so now this whole area is now owned by the refuge. And the project plan, and there again, you see another view of it, this time from the north. You can see kind of how the levee works there. That's the line in green sort of there. And there's Highway 14. But the new project will remove the levee here, and it will rebuild a levee here to protect the wastewater treatment plant and these homes here. But then all the rest of the refuge is going to be opened up to its more natural state. And this is what that's going to look like. So here again, the island is down here, Reed Island is here. Here's the Wildlife Refuge. Here's the existing dike, and that's all going to be removed. And all of this land and Steigerwald Lake is currently the dark blue you see here, but it's going to more turn into its more natural wetlands habitat. And they're going to still maintain a trail system out there. They're going to build some bridges over the main inflows that are the breaches and the dikes they're going to create. And so this will really create a new a restoration of wetlands that will, I think if I'm not mistaken, it will be the largest wetlands restoration project on the lower Columbia River, increasing wetlands in the lower Columbia watershed by 17%, I believe. And so this is exactly the kind of thing we'd love to see happen more. I don't know how many more locations there are that are open to this within our service area of the scenic area itself, but there's lots of places, as I'm sure many of you know, that have been, industrialized corporate mentality is it looks at a wetland and it just sees it as, wasteland to be filled in and built on top of. So there's lots of natural wetlands that was done to over the decades. And there's lots of opportunity to return wetlands to their more natural state. We would love to see this happen many more places throughout the region. And it ties into what everybody's been saying already. This is more the mentality of working with the land rather than trying to dominate over it. This is the mentality of not, what was mentioned earlier with the more native indigenous mentality of working to restore and work with the way the natural systems are supposed to work, rather than trying to impose an industrialized mentality and solution on top of everything. If anybody has any questions about the project, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Thanks for sharing all these details and visuals with us. How exciting! It's really good it's exciting to learn more about this restoration project. Thanks again. So for now, I'm going to pass the mic to Justin, who's going to be moderating the question and A session. So we'll open the floor for questions from our audience. Also, feel free, if you prefer, to write your questions in the chat room. Erica will be keeping an eye on these. And so Justin, do you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Tahira. So I want to thank everyone, all the presenters, and everyone for being here today. I know this during COVID times, this can be a little awkward, but I think this is going great. And so we have some prompts for some Q&A questions. And so I kind of wanted to explain how we're thinking this will work. So I'll read the prompt. You can either, as Tahira noted, place the answer to your question in the chat, and I'll have kind of the questions laid out there as well. Or if anyone knows how to use the participant list to raise their hand, I can call on you at that point as well, just to be equitable with our time. And then you can either answer the prompt or any questions you might have related to any of the presenters. So when thinking about the work that you do, particularly in relation to SDGs 14 and 15, I would like everyone to think about a few questions that each of our presenters have answered today. Where are you? Where do you want to go? And how will you get there? The last question of how you will get there is particularly important during these pandemic times as we're looking towards the future. What innovative solutions has your organization implemented to continue to move towards accomplishing its goals? Has alternative funding been explored? Are your efforts being scaled back due to COVID? So we kind of want to crowd think that, and I'll put the questions here. Everyone take a few minutes to think about that.
I've got two questions so far. One is for Ryan, and the question is, does Friends of the Columbia Gorge consult with local tribes to return land to its natural state?
Thank you. That's a really good question. Unfortunately for this specific project, we're not really in charge of the actual restoration itself. That is more in the hands of the Lower Columbia River Estuary Partnership and the Steigerwald National Wildlife Refuge. I, of course, would encourage them to consult with the local tribes in the area for any of this, but since we don't really have any direct control over that, our role was specifically to sort of act as the middleman between the private landowner who used to own that ranch land and working to get that land into the hands of the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, who runs the wildlife refuge, so that they could do the restoration project. When it comes to other any kinds of restoration projects, we would of course be very much open to working with the tribes on any of our own land trust lands. The Friends of the Columbia Gorge has a land trust, so we own land out in the gorge. And we try to, unless there's a specific reason to keep it closed off to the public, we always try to make it open and accessible to the public, which of course includes the native tribes. The tribes have treaty rights throughout the Columbia River National Scenic Area. So they are allowed to go pretty much anywhere there are first foods growing, for example, as far as I'm aware, to do first food collection. They are also granted treaty right river access, so they're able to access the river for fishing, to do their traditional fishing. So that's something we very much support. We are the main watchdog group for the Columbia River Gorge Commission, and one of our priorities, many priorities these days at the Gorge Commission, is making sure they are maintaining and listening to tribal issues and concerns as it comes to river access, first foods, that sort of thing. The Columbia Gorge is going through a management plan review right now, which is a very vital process where they basically review how it is they implement the National Scenic Area Act. And unfortunately, from our position, they're not doing a very good job of it. And so it would be wonderful if more people could get involved with that and kind of hold their feet to the fire, make sure that they're doing the right things when it comes to first food protections, natural resource protections, salmon protections, and things like even climate change, that they're kind of dropping the ball on these days.
Okay, another question for you, Ryan. How receptive this week was the Columbia River Gorge Commission to protecting your conservation measures, protecting the salmon from industrialization pressures?
Really good question. I'm assuming that's referring to saying this week, because they just had a 2-day long meeting yesterday and the day before, focused on plan review, focused on a number of issues such as natural resource protection. And unfortunately, like I just said, in our opinion, they're not doing enough. They're kind of dropping the ball on a lot of the key protections. For instance, they have been saying all along that they would be analyzing their management plan, meaning their implementation of the National Scenic Area Act, through a lens of climate change, meaning that when they went through all these focus topics, they would also be incorporating climate change. And they have failed to do that. They failed to conduct any kind of meaningful action plan on climate change, even on things that we feel should be obvious and pertain directly to natural resource protection in the gorge, such as, for instance, increasing stream buffers around project development sites or clear-cut logging in certain areas of the gorge, which would really help to, if you increase those buffers, that would really help to protect and revitalize and build resiliency, climate resiliency for things like salmon and just the ecosystem health of streams and rivers in general. So yeah, to kind of sum up, they're somewhat receptive to these conversations, but when it comes to actually turning those concerns around into meaningful action, that's where I think the Columbia River Gorge Commission has been dropping the ball, unfortunately.
Awesome, thank you, Ryan. We have another question here. This one's for Cassie. Is the ongoing deregulation from the current administration influencing the historical 6 treaties you mentioned? If so, how?
I haven't heard anything about the 6 treaty tribes being affected yet. That I know of. It's possible, but I haven't heard anything in the news, and I haven't checked yet with them. They, sometimes Yakima Nation will back other national tribes' efforts. They're pretty active, so it's possible that they're involved in like the East Coast tribal land issue. But yeah. And it's the 6 tribes are Warm Springs, Nez Perce, Yakima, Grand Ronde, Siletz, and I'm missing one, Umatilla.
Awesome, thank you, Cassie. Another question for you, actually. I did not hear who the polluters are for the activities that led to the formation of the Superfund sites. Can you elaborate on that, and what is withholding Metro to invest in cleaning up these Superfunds?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So there are over 150 polluters that are identified as potentially on the hook for clean up by the Environmental Protection Agency. So most of them are industry, and they range from Fortune 500 companies like Chevron and Monsanto to all the way down to Schnitzer Steel here, and all of the companies along the river from the Broadway Bridge up to Sylvie Island. So that's kind of the 10+ mile stretch there. And then historical property owners along that area. And then the city and the state, Department of State Lands, and the Port of Portland. And then Metro, they bought just one property, Willamette Cove, in 1996 with levy money without really thinking about the implications. And when they were hoping to transfer that to the city of Portland back then to become a nature park, and the city ended up not wanting it because it was so contaminated. So they have sat on it because of the fear of finding out how much it was going to cost, and just, the liability. They just sat on it for some time, assuming they wouldn't be able to find the money to clean it up, until the Port of Portland recently stepped in to pay 90% of the cleanup. So the port and Metro are working together with our coalition and others on a remedial design plan. However, it's kind of always the case that these parties are looking to reduce cost. And so, their plan is to develop a trail called the North Portland Greenway Trail to connect up with the trail on both sides of Willamette Cove, to make that connection and develop the trail that's on the very outer edge of that property, but to not have any access down to the river whatsoever. So they want to do natural habitat on the whole rest of the area, which, I think a lot of community members are totally in support of restoration, habitat restoration, but they want to also find some balance, for human access as well. And other, there's lots of ideas out there that the community would like to see, but we're not, nobody's pushing for, having it be developed into, residential property or industry or something like that. So it's just more people wanting access and salmon habitat and everything else. So kind of finding a way to integrate. But currently the plan is not to have any access down to the river itself. So we're working with just all those agencies to try to push that issue, because we know it's really important, because people are already down there, even though they're getting exposed to pretty serious toxins. People go down there already, so we need to make it safe for them. So you can see a list if you do a Google search for, Portland Harbor. The acronym is PRPs. You'll find a list either on a few different sites, and it's 150. So it's a lot.
Thank you, Cassie. We have another question here for Kevin. Kevin, can you speak to the effect of SB 13, the tribal history/shared history curriculum integration in Oregon specifically, in respect to distance learning during COVID? Do you find that an effective place to begin/continue engaging in the value change you described? Has changed and you described?
Yeah, it's a fundamental building block. And what it's going to counter is a great deal of cultural invisibility. Native history has not been included for the large part in the curriculum on almost any level. By requiring this material to be taught, people that are in Oregon are going to get a more accurate, fuller history, their own history. I've spoken with people in different regions of the state, and they have no idea what happened on the land where they live, or how people were removed. So forcing people to have to deal with that is very important. Now, when it comes to long distance or distance learning, it's going to be a real challenge, because I know, for example, at PSU, we have a native food justice course. And so students learn about first foods and native agricultural techniques. Students will actually go out into the field and, say, dig up camas in with traditional digging tools, and bring the camas back to campus to plant, to make the campus more of a native species campus. And also learning the skills. We have to remember that Native people were separated by force from their culture. People were removed, people were punished for learning those type of things. And so this, now that the state is reversing that policy, is a huge step forward. I'm hoping that this distance learning does not last too long, because part of what goes on in a Native Studies class is community building, and it's very difficult to do that on a computer screen, where you can't see each other. You can't. Some classes like to sit in circles. Some classes have show and tell. Basically, people bring in artifacts or foods, or they share tea. They smudge. You can't do that distance learning. So that's a huge component of the Native classroom. So like I said, I'm hoping that this doesn't last too long. But because they got guidance from Native activists when writing the bill, it's a really important milestone. I hope that answers that question.
That was great. Thank you, Kevin.
And I just wanted to chime in real quick, if I could. I asked this question to the group chat, but in case you guys didn't see it, but if there was anything that any of the presenters, I was curious to know if you all have any questions for one another. It's always interesting to learn from the experts talking to other experts.
Well, I have a question. There's a group called the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, and that's a multi-tribal organization. They give advice to a lot of groups. I'm wondering if they're involved in these projects that you're all working on?
Yeah, CRITFIC is their short name. They, I know they used to be more involved in Portland Harbor, but the tribes, the treaty tribes, I'm pretty sure what happened was they've taken on direct government to government roles. You know, they have official roles, and it's a treat. You know, they have signed agreements with EPA, and memorandums of agreements with EPA on a couple different levels, and other agencies as well. So CRITFIC isn't needed in that way. They're kind of staying out because the tribes are playing a direct role. So the tribes have representatives on a technical coordinating committee that reviews any critical document before it's finalized, and even before the public gets to see it. And then they also serve as trustees on the Natural Resource Trustee Council that oversees the Natural Resource Damage Act and salmon habitat and restoration based on the damage that's been done to salmon habitat in the Portland Harbor and the broader Willamette River area. So they actually govern that council. And so CritFic isn't, there's not a real direct role for them right now. But recently they got, I know someone at CritFic got concerned because one of the recent reductions to the Portland Harbor cleanup included sort of oversight of looking at human consumption of clams. And is that right? Yeah, yeah, clams. And so, for example, I think Ibrahim had to get off, but there's one young woman who's living in a shelter right now, and she talks openly about how for several months until she found out that it was not safe, she probably was catching about 50 clams per month to consume, you know, as a source of protein, and they're really unsafe. So it's a huge concern, and there's no, you know, no signage down there or anything.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and yeah, CritFic is very familiar to me. Obviously, they are very involved in everything on the Columbia River, which includes within the confines of the National Scenic Area. They are often engaged at the Gorge Commission, and they've been great partners on a lot of the other work we've been doing over the last 10 years with a lot of other environmental coalition allies regarding the transport of fossil fuels through the region and the building of new, or the attempted building of new fossil fuel terminals, which we've defeated all of, 12 out of 12, which was great. A great success. All of the trains that would have serviced those facilities would have gone through the Columbia River Gorge. With the specific wetlands restoration project at Steigerwald that I was talking about, I'm sorry, I don't actually know if they're involved in that at all. That's a question that someone with a Lower Columbia River Estuary Partnership or Department of Fish and Wildlife would probably be able to answer better than me, or our land trust director. I talked about it today because I thought it was the most pertinent issue to what our topic was, but it's not my field of expertise. It's a land trust led program there, that restoration project, which is not where I work. I work in the conservation department. So but yeah, CritFic is very familiar to us. They're a very helpful organization in many ways. And yeah, should often be invited to participate in any kinds of projects or talks like this, because yeah, they know what they're doing.
I see Kim and Caitlin's questions. Should I take a?
Oh yeah, go for it, Cassie.
Take a stab. Okay. Kim, yeah, I wish Ibrahim could speak now, but he had to leave. Yeah, I mean, we're hearing actually I mean, of course, people are struggling, houseless people everywhere. And, you know, there's more, I think the city recently put in a few more rest areas and shelters in the inner central city, 2 downtown, or maybe 1 downtown and 2 on the central east side. But further down the river, there's not much in terms of resources or hygiene stations for people, you know, and there's not enough space in those shelters or those rest areas that the city has designated. I think the capacity is 150 people, and there's thousands of people on the street right now. But even more so, there's even a shortage, or it's harder for people to get access to basic needs in the outer east area of Portland and the county. So we've actually been doing outreach out there, and Ibrahim's been hearing a lot from people out there who don't have access to food, water, a place to use the restroom, or to take a shower or wash their hands. We've been talking with a couple of, you know, some other grassroots groups who are hoping to actually put in some hygiene stations in these different houseless community areas or rest areas soon, just because the government agencies aren't working fast enough, and it's a huge need, especially since a lot of the businesses are closed where they used to use the restrooms. So I mean, we're hearing directly from people on the street that it's a problem, that they don't like that. And then Caitlin, I don't know anything about any group that's working on building gardens for houseless folks. I know that there used to be the Muslim Community Center of Portland had a pretty good partnership. I think it was with Right to Survive or Right to Dream too, several years ago, before they constructed their new building. And I don't know if they have a garden now in that same partnership. I just don't really know. Although, let's see, there's one group that is off of Greeley that has some small houses, and I'm pretty sure that group is it's self-governed by houseless folks, and they have a garden area, and I think they're looking to have more support and equipment to maintain their gardens. So Caitlin, if you are curious about that, I'm happy to help try to connect you with some of the people that are organizers over there.
Awesome. Thank you, Cassie.
Yeah.
And thank you to everyone who asked questions and the presenters for being here. We close around at 6 tonight, so I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic over to Naraja for some final remarks.
Thank you, Justin. And thanks everyone for joining us. Just want to say thank you. And it's just a quick wrap up and a couple of things that I'm taking away from these talks. The thing that's stuck in my head is the seventh generation principle. Thank you, Kevin, for highlighting that. And Ibrahim and Cassie for talking about how we have misused the river, the image of the stunted, mutated tadpoles and the jellyfish. They stay in my head, and I'm making that connection to what we heard later from Kevin with the kinds of the historical pollution that has happened in Flint, and how even very recently we have suffered from brain damage and other issues that are a repercussion of how we have treated our resources. So what I'm seeing, and just one more thing that Ryan mentioned about working with the land. To me, it comes all full circle with SDG 14 and 15, and Tahira, which Tahira and Owen mentioned in the beginning, about life on land and life below water, right? To me, depending on where you are, your perspective, what is above is also below. Think about it. For a jellyfish, this is above. For me, that's below. But if I'm using both the spaces, the above and below, to nourish me, to make life possible for me and other species, engaging in the process of connecting the above and below is important. And that's one of the reasons when we brainstormed as a team, we thought we should bring these two SDGs together for the talk. So I want to say thank you to all of you for making those connections for us, and illustrating how we treat our water resources is going to come back to us in one way or the other. And how we treat our land, for example, like how Kevin mentioned about oak savannas and what we are currently seeing with the fire. So it all comes back to this cycle of management and how we respect or do not respect, or value or do not value the things that the earth provides for us. So I want to just say thank you to all the speakers for bringing this message so elegantly and really braiding it for us in such a nice way. And we will be sharing a blog which will come out of this presentations and this time we have had together, and all the thoughtful questions you have posted, and probably also update the a short version of this recording in YouTube, and we will be in touch with all of you with those resources. So thank you all again, and stay well. And I want to thank everybody in the RNC team, Tahira, Erica, Owen, Kevin, Justin, and I want to say thanks to Pranoti, all of us who have stayed together to do pull this off. To all the speakers and all the participants, thank you very much. And to Kim for providing the technical support and making the Zoom possible. So just gratitude to all of you, and thank you very much.
Irja, don't forget about the trivia too.
Hey, Owen, why don't you say about the trivia? You want to say that?
Sure. Well, this is actually Tahira and Pranoti's idea to do a little trivia follow-up of this in a couple of weeks with just some notes from these various presentations as a way of reinforcing some of the things we've learned. So keep your eyes peeled. We'll send out an invite to a little online trivia thingamajig.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that, Owen. And I wanted to invite all of you for the trivia. As Owen mentioned, we actually did a trivia as a team to try it out, and it was so much fun. So really looking forward to seeing all of you again engage with us with the trivia that our team is going to put out. So grateful to all of you. Excellent. And just a group hug from far away to all of you. And you know what? I really miss that, Kevin. And I'm glad you mentioned that, the fact that we can't, this is surreal, and it's lovely to see everyone, and we still pull this off. So much love, much gratitude, and big hugs to everyone. And stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.